For what will it profit them to gain the whole world, but to lose their soul? In the 1970s, Werner Erhard gave controversial seminars around the Bay Area that were part of the human potential movement. He pointed out how difficult it is to really change your life, and he offered strategies that might help. Erhard believed that any form of personal transformation necessarily begins with language, with the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. These often unconscious pictures shape what Erhard calls, quote, the way the world shows up for us. They are the contexts which determine our actions. So nothing in our life will change until we can begin to question these basic assumptions about ourselves. Really, Erhard offers a hopeful message. We can change our relationship to the past so that it no longer controls our future. We can do this by dedicating ourselves to what Erhard calls a possibility. And by this, he means a goal, a guiding goal for what we hope to accomplish every time we show up. Whenever you enter a room, whenever you pick up the phone to have a conversation, whenever you're involved in a Zoom conversation, you bring with you that possibility, that goal for transformation. For me, the possibility is the peace of Christ. It's the recognition that all people are God's beloved children, and that the world is God's creation, made in love for us and for the world. This is the gospel. This is the good news of Jesus Christ. The Anglican theologian Donald Allchin sums up the human condition in these words. We seek what is beyond us, but our desire remains baffled. We are thrown back on ourselves by the enigmas of sin and suffering, of frustration and death. Of ourselves, we cannot attain the goal for which we long. It is only when another comes out from the unknown world of eternity to meet us and opens to us the way through that we can find the fulfillment of the desire which we know within ourselves. In Christ, God's self, comes out to meet us and becomes the way which leads into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus meets us this morning in today's gospel. I've spoken many times about the urgency with which this gospel is written, the imperatives, the short language, and perhaps we feel this sense of intensity because Jesus' ministry is so clear leading up to his own death, and we see it in so many ways. The German theologian Martin Kahler calls it a passion narrative with an extended introduction. In Mark, Jesus predicts his own death 3 times. In today's gospel, he teaches the disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. A chapter later, in Mark chapter 9, verse 31, Jesus says the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. And then, yet again, in Mark chapter 10, Jesus exclaims, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him." But this horrible prediction is not all that the 3 stories share in common. In each case, as Jesus tells the story in the clearest, most unambiguous terms possible, in each case, his disciples cannot hear him. They almost draw the exact reverse conclusion that he intends for them to draw. We all have this experience in life of simply not being heard. We also have the experience of things that are so horrible and tragic and crazy that we cannot face them. We cannot see them for what they are. But in these stories, it is an extreme version of this. Immediately after Jesus' prediction in chapter 9, the disciples argue over which one is the best. At the end of chapter 10, and after Jesus says this, James and John come up to Jesus and say that they want to have special seats when Jesus comes into his glory. They don't realize, like the reader does, that they are inadvertently asking to be at Jesus' right hand and left hand when he's crucified and dies. All this brings us back to today's gospel. And after Jesus explains what will happen to him, his friend Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your mind on human things rather than divine things." And the Greek is a little bit more ambiguous than this. But Jesus is basically saying to Peter in the most emphatic terms possible, you cannot follow me and recommend that I should try to avoid the cross. Following me is the cross. Indeed, at the very center of the Gospel of Mark lies an extraordinarily powerful idea. It is that there are two opposing views that are at war at every level of our experience, from our unconscious thoughts all the way to the level of societies and perhaps to all of history itself. According to one perspective, might makes right. The only thing that matters is having power over others. And that power could be money or fame or good looks or political influence. It could be a sense that God will help you to defeat your enemies. The Christian nationalists who overtook the U.S. Capitol, they talk in these terms, as if God is authorizing them to violence so that they will make America a Christian country by force. It's exactly the opposite of what Jesus intends. But they're not the only ones to regard the world as merely a matter of power. Many people believe this. Many think it's the only option. They believe this, and so they say it's a dog-eat-dog world, or money talks, or some similar way of expressing it. But in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus offers an alternative. He shows how God acts outside of the structures that we expect God to be in, outside of the church, outside of the temple, outside of the high priest. And in opposition to the ideal of a self which receives value by having power over others, he asserts that real greatness comes from serving others. That in fact, the greatest one of all is the one who is servant of all. So within us lie these two potential selves. Each seeks to exercise power over the other. And each of them totally at odds with each other, each trying to take possession of us. And it's a zero-sum game. Whatever one part of us gains, that other part of us will lose. With every action and every thought, we affirm either the first thesis or the second. Archbishop Desmond Tutu writes that the essence of Nazism wasn't so much anti-Semitism as it was the belief that the strong deserved to rule over the weak. Nazism was about a lust for power. And Tutu, who preached from this very pulpit, points out a truth that I tell people who are in pre-marriage counseling. And that is that love is not a feeling primarily. Love is an action that happens when we choose to steadfastly care for others. And the feeling that this generates is what we often mistake for love. Instead of evaluating our relationships on the basis of nebulous feelings that come and go, we need to focus our attention on what we are actually doing. My old teacher, Cornell West, used to be fond of saying, tenderness is what love feels like in private. Justice is what love looks like in public. So what does it look like for a person to radically devote themselves to love? Frankly, it looks like the death of the self which seeks to control others. It looks like taking up your cross. Why do we follow Jesus when we know that it will inevitably lead to some suffering? Jesus tells people the truth about themselves. He dedicated his life to forgiveness and healing. He unites us to God, the one who loved us from the very beginning and will love us beyond the end. He draws us into the church, which carries us through our own personal darkness. And Jesus gives our life purpose. Jesus gives us a way to live a life that matters. A few years ago, a man armed with an AK-47 and 500 rounds of ammunition walked into an elementary school in Decatur, Georgia. And fortunately for everyone involved, his first action was to take as a hostage the school's bookkeeper, an African-American woman named Antoinette Tuff. And though she's a middle-aged woman and he's a young white man and he threatened her life, she spoke to him as if he was a part of her family. She called him baby. She told him that she loved him. She promised that if he put his guns down, that she would stay with him until the police arrived and that he would not be hurt. And ultimately, that is exactly what happened. You can look on the internet and listen to the 911 tapes. At the end, she told the operator, she said, "I've never been so scared in all my life." Something in Antoinette made it possible for her to overcome her fear, to reach across all the boundaries that separated those two people and to form a new connection. She knew something about suffering herself, and she told him how human it is to feel that you've reached the end of your rope. But Antoinette Tuff had something else going for her. She had her faith. In church, her minister had taught her how to pray inwardly, had taught the congregation to pray on the inside, to find an anchor in God when things were bad in the world, a connection to the infinite, to the love of the Father. And it's precisely what she did. As everyone around her viewed the gunman as nothing more than a threat, she miraculously could somehow see him as a child of God. And this helped her to offer him a chance to see what he had in common with everyone else in that building. She brought with her a new possibility, a possibility that seemed unimaginable to others. I began this morning with Werner Erhard's observation about how difficult it is to really change, how we need a new story, a new possibility that can create a future that is different than anything else we have ever experienced. I talked about that desire for connection, for what is beyond us, and about how Jesus reaches out to help. We considered the way that the Gospel of Mark reveals two opposing forces, moving us to either depend on power or on love. And we remembered that love ultimately is an action before it is a feeling. All of this together shows how a person like Antoinette Tuff can be empowered by God to become a true hero. What will you bring into being through God's abiding grace? What is your possibility?